Hello everyone, I hope you're doing alright. Today we're talking about the Shield Specialist Vanguard, the basically intro to tanking class. It's a lot of fun, very straightforward. Let's talk about it. For tertiary stats, if you are playing in PvE, shoot for like 6,000 shield and then throw everything else into absorb. If you're playing PvP, just equip a shield in the offhand and then throw everything else into crit and you should be ready to rock and roll. For our tacticals, some people like oil slick. It's good. It's a little finicky for my taste. I like thermal screen. It makes things just a little bit more easy in terms of getting some of our bursts off. Some of our energy blasts off. I personally like thermal screen. You can also run Life Warden if you haven't invested in a tanking tactical yet. And then PvP, if you can afford it, get the Neuro Trigger. This is a crafted tactical, so do with that as you see fit. For our implants, Squad Leader is great for group content, and then Super Commando is great for essentially cheesy mechanics. It makes you almost immortal for 3 seconds. If you're doing PvP though, you can totally get away with running the Mandalorian armaments and the Shock Trooper package. It's just more DPS, frankly. You have a lot of passive mitigation in PvP for a tank, so we don't really worry about those pesky defensive stats. For our combat style, very quickly, Pulse Cannon is just like the most fun, is the best in my opinion. If you need to be hypermobile, you can experiment with Poison Man or defensive armor, but just default to Pulse Cannon. Reserve Cables is just the best. There's not a lot of use case for both of these, except for killing your friends with extraction plan, so do with that as you see fit. Frontline Soldier is just the best for passive mitigation. We love to see it. Cortosis Weave Armor is what I kind of default to here. It just has a little bit of the best mitigation rather passively. You can get Reactive Round if you want to have more of those sonic rounds, or you can have Stealth Scan if you want to be moving a little bit faster, or rather help your teammates move a little bit faster. Electro Shield is passive damage. We love to see it. Reflective Armor is also passive damage. We love to see it. Some people will run Entangling Tools, especially in PvP though, so if you want to be really obnoxious, you can run Entangling Tools. Hold the Line's the most generally useful here. If you're in PvP, you can run Cryo Grenade, and if you have no use for either movement speed or stuns, you can take Guard Cannon. It's better than nothing, but it's kind of bad. And finally, Sonic Rebounder is probably the most requested ability here. It's a very, very good ability. But if you're in PvP, though, you can run Efficient Tools. Personally, I just default back to the Rebounder. All right. Couple things as we get into the little guide here. First thing we need to do is turn on Target of Target. If you're going to go into your interface, you're going to make sure that this little thing here called Target of Target has been enabled. This is going to make sure that the boss is currently targeting you. You can see right here the target dummy is targeting no one. If I taunt the dummy, it's now going to target me. This way we make sure that the boss is hitting us instead of hitting our friends. It just makes things easier, okay? Our job as the tank is to get hit in the face as much as possible, and to prevent our friends from getting hit in the face as much as possible as well. We do this by generating threat. We don't really care about the raw damage numbers. We care about how much threat we are generating, all right? So we have a couple of ways to generate threat. The first way to generate threat is just by plain old doing damage, all right? It's not that exciting. Our basic priority tree for single target has been listed here in this little priority tree. We'll start from the top. Energy Blast consumes power screens. How do we build power screens? Well, we shield damage passively, which is pretty darn nice, or we trigger our Ion Cell. Ion Cell will trigger passively from your attacks. It'll just happen over time. For example, here, if I hit my hammer shot a couple times, you can see the shock debuff says, yes, Ion Cell is triggering. Great, 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 great. And you can see as this Ion Cell is triggering, we're slowly building stacks of power screen. If we want to consume 3 stacks of these power screens, we can use it on a Energy Blast. It provides a little bit of a defensive buff, and it does a bit of Aoe damage. It also generates a lot of threat. So, recapping very quickly. These little purple guys right here, power screens, we consume 3 of them into an Energy Blast, in which gives us a little bit of defense, which is pretty darn nice, and it generates a whole lot of threat. It's also an Aoe. We want to spam this pretty much as often as possible. It'll be glowing when you can use it. Hit it, all right? It's a great ability. Boop, does a whole bunch of damage. The next 2 abilities that are the most important are going to be our High Impact Bolt and our Stock Strike. Now, High Impact Bolt is only usable on targets that are currently vulnerable. Vulnerable means either stunned or taking periodic damage. But if you remember, because of this ion cell, the target will be actually taking periodic damage relatively frequently. And so if we use our high impact bolt, boop, it'll do a whole bunch of damage. It's also an AoE now, which is great. It generates a whole bunch of threat. And it will automatically trigger one of our power screens. So it's a nice little ability. We love to see it. All right. So we want to be smashing our high impact bolt as often as possible. Next, we want to be hitting our stock strike as often as possible. Stock strike generates a whole bunch of threat. We'll always trigger our shock to debuff on the target to get that ion cell essentially triggering. It's a great ability. We want to be hitting this as often as possible. Additionally, it'll occasionally come off a cooldown when you get hit. If it comes off cooldown, great. There's not a lot you can do to really force it to trigger. Just expect it to become off a cooldown faster than you might think. So gives us ions, or gives us our ion cells, which we can then use back into our energy blast. It's a good time. Be hitting these 3 buttons as often as possible. All right. The next most important ability here is our pulse cannon. Now, pulse cannon is as a result of our pulse cannon utility choice right here. It'll cast for about 3 seconds, boop, does a whole bunch of damage in an AoE, generates a whole bunch of threat. It's pretty darn nice. Additionally, when we attack, we have a high chance of triggering a glowing pulse cannon, which is going to have a 1.5 second cast, boop, does a whole bunch of damage very, very quickly. This will happen once every 15 seconds or so, so you can kind of be expecting your pulse cannon to come off a cooldown when it gets down to like 3 or 4 seconds left, all right? So there we go, pulse cannon is now glowing, which means it's gonna do damage much faster. Just hit it, all right, it's a whole bunch of damage. There's not a lot of interactions here, frankly, between all these abilities. It's just kind of like hit the ability that's up on the list here. So energy blast and stock strike. Oh, this is glowing, I should hit this. Oh, this is glowing, I should hit this, blah, 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 blah. But for the most part, these abilities should be on cooldown most of the time. This is where people run into problems, all right? Because you're gonna be tempted to spam Ion Pulse over and over and over and over and over again. Ion Pulse does a fair bit of damage. It's a fun little ability. However, it will destroy your cells. So, if you drop below like 65% cells, please use Hammer Shot instead of Ion Pulse. If you're at high cells, you can use Ion Pulse. If you're dropping down to the low cells, please use Hammer Shot. The way our cells work is that the lower our cells get, the slower they regenerate. So we don't really want to get down to like no cell land here. We do have the option of using our recharge cells to kind of bail us out one time, but that's kind of like a one-time deal. So if you screw up more than once, you're going to be in trouble. Thank goodness it popped just in time. So that's the basics of doing single target damage. Let's hop into this flashpoint and see how we get going here. That is the basics of actually doing damage and building threat that way, but we do have some other abilities here that we can use to generate extra threat, which I'm just going to call high threat abilities. For example, our harpoon here doesn't do a whole bunch of damage. However, it generates a whole lot of threat. And so what we can do is if we harpoon a target, it will say, hey, you now have a whole bunch of threat. Actually, let me pull up start parts here for the purposes of this guide while we wait for this man to go over here and click the talk button. We can use our high threat abilities, especially in the opener, to make sure that we are starting off the encounter with as much threat as possible. Our job, or our goal rather, is to build so much threat that we don't really risk the DPS pulling off of us. However, sometimes this happens. Some AP PT goes ballistic, some Deception Sin decides that he wants to taunt the boss. That's okay. We can get around this using our taunts. We have 2 taunts here. The first is Neural Jolt, which does, a single target taunt, not too shabby. The second is our Sonic Round, which taunts all the enemies in the area. Taunts do a couple of things for us. First, and most obviously, it forces the target to attack you for a few seconds, sort of for 6 seconds to be exact here. So, hold on, let's see if these guys have any stealthers. They don't. All right. So, for example, this next to right here, I want him to attack me. Boop, I'm going to taunt him to make sure that he attacks me for the next 6 seconds. Additionally, so you can see here, this guy wasn't attacking me. Now we taunt him. Now he's attacking me. Great. Additionally, taunt makes sure that you now have the most threat. It's going to match your current threat with the highest threat in the raid. So that way, you're not only getting the short-term solution of, oh yes, the current target is now attacking me. Additionally, it will put a long-term solution of now I have the highest threat in the raid. Now you have to follow that up with actually doing damage and keeping that threat, but that's neither here nor there. All right, so one quick note. Taunts do nothing in PvP. All right, they do absolutely nothing. There's no such thing as threat in PvP. You really don't care about it. However, taunts will reduce the damage that your teammates take. So if you throw your taunts out pretty much as often as possible in PvP, you'll get a whole bunch of protection medals. Your teammates really appreciate it. All right. Now, let's quickly talk about doing AoE damage. We essentially have 3 primary abilities for doing AoE damage. The first is our Pulse Cannon here. Now, Pulse Cannon, we already mentioned previously, it just does a whole bunch of damage. All right. We love to see it. Free damage pretty much all the time. It's great. All right. It's a great little ability here. The second most important ability here is our Artillery Blitz. Artillery Blitz does a whole bunch of AoE damage very, very quickly and generates a high amount of threat. We want to be combining these 2 big AoE abilities pretty much as often as possible. It also knocks down not strong targets. So you can see here all these targets get knocked down. Great, fantastic, which lines them up perfectly for a beautiful pulse cannon. Additionally, we can use our flak shell to knock down not strong targets. It's pretty great. Additionally, we could be spamming our explosive surge to make sure that we're generating as much threat as possible. Especially in big AoE situations, it's easy to lose threat on individuals here though, so just, kind of generally be careful. Give me 2 seconds, I need to go let Duke in. All right, apologies about that. So just one more time for the road here. AoE abilities, Pulse Cannon, very, very strong. Artillery Blitz, very, very strong. And then spam with Flak Shell and Explosive Surge, and you should be ready to rock and roll. When we are gathering up ads like this, we want to make sure that we're kind of grouping them up for all of our, melee monkeys to kind of go ballistic in. So we kind of want to pull everyone together and make one big happy family, so that way they can do a whole bunch of AoE damage and then feel really good about themselves. We can accomplish this by either just straight up pulling them, make sure all the melees come stand together. It's pretty, generally accepted to be a good thing. Or we could do things like use our harpoon to pull people closer. So generally, we want to be setting up this big AoE because our own AoE is it's okay, right? It's nice to do a fair bit of damage. However, we're really here to help out the DPS in this standpoint, so please group your ads. I'm sure your players will appreciate it. Right, so that's single target damage. That's an AoE damage. There are other ways to help with your threat, though. So we talked about Taunt, how it's going to make the target attack you, give you the most threat in the current raid group. However, we have this extra tool here called Guard. We want to use Guard on the target that's currently generating the most amount of threat, because we don't really want them pulling off of us, right? We'd much rather it make our lives easier by not having them generate as much threat. So what you do is you either look at the group and say, which one of these people seem like they have the biggest threat penis, or you can just take a look at the raid threat meter here. So for example, Mr. Dalston has been absolutely pumping numbers, so I've been guarding him. This is gonna make him generate a whole lot less threat, which is gonna be really helpful. So that way he's not, pulling threat on the boss and pulling the boss's attention. Please don't guard your healers in PvE. It's not that helpful. Additionally, while they are standing within 15 meters, 50% of the damage that he takes will be redirected back to me, which is great. It helps our DPS monkeys take less damage. Quick note, for PvPers, please do not just stick your guard on one target for the entire match. It's not very helpful. You want to be throwing your guard on the target that's currently taking the most amount of damage to help them, live. So please do not just stick your guard on one person. Be swapping it over and over and over again. It's pretty important. All right. So we've talked about doing damage. We've talked about building threat. Let's talk about actually the most important part of tanking here, which is not taking damage. All right. Now it's going to sound counterintuitive to not take damage. However, being a tank means that you have many different utilities. For example, defensive cooldowns. That's going to make you take less damage over time. We want to make our healers work as little as humanly possible. Now, before we dive into this, we had to understand some of the fundamental core concepts here of tanking and just damage in general in SWTOR. Damage is broken down into 3 types. The first is white damage. White damage, if you see here, if I rifle attack, is mostly considered to be weapon damage. So anytime you attack with a blaster or a saber, you're probably going to do white damage. Tech and force damage is going to be called yellow damage. It's stuff that you use like grenades or fire or the force. That is yellow damage. And finally, there's internal damage. So white damage, which is damage from weapons, can be completely dodged if your defense chance is high enough, right? If you have white damage, you can completely dodge it. It can also be reduced, which is, let me ready track real here. It can also be reduced. Yellow damage, on the other hand, cannot be reduced. Yellow damage cannot be dodged. It can only be reduced. So what that means is that if you see an ability that's like heavy force, you probably aren't going to dodge it, which means that you need to pop some defensive cooldowns. All right? Finally, there's the internal damage. We kind of just eat the internal damage, if I'm honest with you. There's not a lot of stuff you can do about internal. You do have like elemental resistance, which is nice, but we don't really have to worry about it. So, to deal with the threat or the damage being done to us, we do this thing called popping defensive cooldowns. Defensive cooldown management is what separates bad tanks from good tanks. If you properly pop your defensives, you'll be considered just a fine tank. This does come with some minor drawbacks though. You can see here, I'm currently just face tanking this boss. It's not really helping out my healer. It would probably be a lot more helpful to my healer if I bothered to pop some defensive cooldowns while I was taking this damage, right? Now tanking is not an easy job. You essentially have to learn to memorize the entire fight before it happens and then respond accordingly. There's just a lot happening here. You kind of have to be paying attention to the encounter, otherwise you're just not going to be as prepared. So we want to be looking for big animations, like this big swipe thing, or this big thing when he raises up his fist and pounds it down on us. We want to be looking for patterns and then learning to pop our defensive cooldowns. So what can we learn from right here? Well, we've learned that he does this big swipe thing, which pushes down the big target. We learned that he does the big overhand shenanigans, so we should probably be popping cooldowns at this time. But what are our cooldowns? Well, I'm glad you asked me. The first of our major cooldowns is our Battle Focus. Battle Focus usually gives us 25% crit. It's pretty darn nice. However, in addition to just giving us crit, because of this passive right here called Soldier's Crit, it also gives us 35% chance to dodge abilities here. So we have a much higher chance of dodging abilities because of popping Battle Focus. Now, let's be honest here. Battle Focus is much more often used in the opener to help build threat, so don't really worry about popping his defensive cooldown right away. Just know that later on in the fight, it'll be very, very useful to have that Battle Focus in your back pocket, but for the most part, just open with it to help you build that initial bit of threat, all right? Our second DCD here is going to be Reactive Shield. Reactive Shield is nice because it just makes us take 25% less damage. It works with both white and yellow damage. It's pretty fantastic, and combined with our passive mitigation, it means that you're probably not going to die. All right, you're going to take a whole lot less damage. You can see here, this is barely touching me when I have my big shield on. It's pretty fantastic. The next defensive cooldown we have here is our Infused Culto packs. Infused Culto packs is actually a pretty unique ability here. So if I pop her right now, you're going to see that I have this stack of tactical armor slowly building up to 5 stacks. You get more stacks the more you're attacked, and the higher your stacks go, the more armor you have. It's pretty nice. Additionally, when these stacks collapse, it will then heal me for 6% per stack. So I don't know if you saw that little green number there. It healed me for like 100k. That's a lot of healing. It also has a relatively short cooldown. You can see here it has like a minute-long cooldown, which means that we can be spamming it relatively frequently. Additionally, it gives us a little bit of immunity shield, which is very nice thanks to our legendary here called Super Commando package. Every time you activate your Culto packs, you essentially get a God Bubble for 3 seconds. It's a great little ability. Next up the docket, we have our Riot Gas. Riot Gas will reduce the target's accuracy by 15%. This is great, especially if you're co-tanking or if you have a whole bunch of mobs gathered up in one place. It's just gonna essentially make the target hit less often, which is pretty nice. Finally, we have our Oh Shoot button, which is Adrenaline Rush. Adrenaline Rush is frankly, it's delaying death more than it is preventing it. Essentially, when you hit Adrenaline Rush, you get this little buff here of this fired up green guy. When you have fired up, if you drop below 35% health, you will rapidly heal for a short period of time. This is a delaying action. It is not it's not a permanent solution, okay? Just know that if you need to, if you're about to die, you can always pop Adrenaline Rush and then delay death for a few seconds. Now you're going to notice here, over the course of that fight, I already had back my Battle Focus. I already had back my Reactive Shield. I already had back my Culto pack. I already had back my Riot Gas. What I'm telling you is that your defensive cooldowns do not have as long of a cooldown as you think it is. And if you're just getting into tanking, a lot of the times people will get concerned that they need to save their cooldown for when you really need it, when you can actually be popping them pretty liberally. When you get to higher tier combat, you can be more concerned about like, oh, I need to save my cooldown for X, Y, and Z. But frankly, pop them. Please, please pop them. Don't overlap them. One cooldown is more than enough to like save your skin. However, you can absolutely 100% be popping your cooldowns very liberally here. You don't really have to worry about it. Smash them whenever you see an attack coming for right now. The more you start to learn about what boss attacks are white damage and yellow damage and what can be dodged and what can be reduced, then you can start to really be concerned about it. However, for the time being, just like generally pop your cooldowns. Even like in trash, you can see here I'm taking a fair bit of damage. It would probably be helpful to my healer if I was actually popping my cooldowns. So I'm going to start doing that from now on just because I want to be more helpful, okay? So that's rule number one about defensive cooldowns. Please pop them. Don't wait till you're at like 40% health. Pop them earlier. We want to be proactive rather than reactive. So for example here, if we jump in here, I'm going to take less damage overall initially and pop a Reactive Shield. It's pretty nice. Especially our Culto or Infused Culto packs. That's very nice for these trash packs here when it only has that like mid-long cooldown. That way we don't really have to worry about it not being available for us if we ever get to a boss here. All right. Rule number two about popping defensive cooldowns. If the ability has already happened and you've already been chunked, don't waste the defensive cooldown. You've already taken the dick. There's no sense in sitting here and being like, oh, I'm going to pop a defensive cooldown after I just got chunked for 80k. It's not helpful. All right? Save your defensive cooldown for when the ability is coming, not for after you've already taken the damage. All right? So those are our primary cooldowns. Again, that is Battle Focus, which helps with our defensive chance and mostly with establishing threat. Our Reactive Shield, which just straight up gives us a bunch of DR and makes us not die very often. Our Culto Infused Med Packs, which is just gives us a little God Shield. It's pretty fantastic. And it's going to increase our armor rating, which is very, very nice. And it's going to heal us when it collapses. You can see here, watch it collapse. Any day now, any day now, any day now. Oh my goodness, you couldn't see it over there. It does a whole bunch of healing, all right? We have our Riot Gas, which reduces the accuracy of a whole bunch of everyone that stands in the gas. It's pretty darn nice. And then finally, our O shoot button of Adrenaline Rush is pretty fantastic. So, let's discuss this very briefly. Tanking is a thankless job. No one cares if you're a good tank. They won't really notice. As long as you have aggro of the boss, you're kind of just like expected to exist, to hold aggro, and then to leave. No one cares about your tanking, as sad as it is to say. But it does come with one very distinct advantage, all right? And the advantage is this. If things go sour, you blame the healer, all right? If things go cattywampus, you say, healer, why didn't you keep me alive, all right? Because no one knows what you're doing as a tank. They don't understand your mechanics. They kind of assume that because you decided to queue tank, you kind of know what you're doing. You can blame the healer. And 90% of the time, they'll believe you because they don't want to sit in queue and wait for another tank to come through, all right? So when in doubt, blame your healer and you should be fine. So that's kind of tanking in a nutshell here. One more time for the road. Our primary abilities come through Energy Blast and our High Impact Bolt and applying our Ion Cells to all these targets. And then Stock Strike and Pulse Cannon are great fillers for single target, which is pretty fantastic. Oh, look, we get to demonstrate our Culto. That's very nice. Let me pull this guy in here. He's getting a little testy. No. All right. Aoes. One last time, Pulse Cannon, fantastic little AoE ability. Artillery Blitz, fantastic little AoE ability. We love to see it. Then we can fill with our Flak Shell and our Explosive Surge. In terms of building threat, doing damage is obviously a great place to start. We also have a couple different options of Harpoon, which is a great way to build a whole lot of threat very quickly, especially in the opener. Finally, Taunting gives you a whole bunch of threat and forces the target to attack you. It's kind of your, I screwed the pooch button. It's pretty nice. Finally, you pop your defensive cooldowns and you should be ready to rock and roll. This has been my tanking guide for the shield tech. Let me know if you have any questions. Leave them down in the comments below. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. I should actually probably start paying attention to this flashpoint at some point here. Probably not. Probably won't. Because I'm tanking. That means I just hold the W key. And then things die. Hope you guys have a fantastic day. Enjoy yourselves. And I'll see you soon.